And this is Chrissy Schott, who was our program manager, and we're hosting tonight. We are a network that is trying to work together to expand the ways we can age well in Yakima and Selah. And so we offer programs, workshops, small interest groups, and services to our members within the scope of our volunteers. And we thank all of our members and our business sponsors. We've got Triply Construction, Conover Insurance, Brunback and Autumn, Thompson Audiology, and our new business sponsor is Baker Boyer Bank. We're really pleased about that. So we welcome Joe Miles this afternoon to talk about the Yakima Valley's Old West history during the 1850s. And do you want to say a word about the fact that we're going to record this and what people need to do about that? And then I'll introduce Joe and we'll get started.
All right, so we are recording. So if you don't want your image to show, you can go ahead and go to stop video and click on that to not have your image showing. And please mute yourself during the recording. During the presentation. I'll send out a link to our YouTube. We do have a YouTube channel. It's on our website. That'll take you right to, excuse me, to all of our videos. But we also on our website have a link to our videos, but I'll email this out to you if you want to watch it again and again and again. But we thank our presenters this evening.
Okay, well, John is being the supporting expert.
He's my IT guy.
Yeah, I'm the one who makes faces in the background.
Great. What? Okay, so we're glad he's our supporting person. And Joe Miles is an author, historian, researcher, and he's got an avid interest in the history of our area. And he's also a volunteer at the Yakima Valley Museum Archives. And that's how Joe and John have connected, among other things. He was born and raised in Richland, and he studied at the University of Arizona, earning a Bachelor's of Science degree in public administration. He served in the Army, and then he subsequently spent more than 30 years working in public administration, including 17 years on the Yakima Reservation. He retired as Municipal Public Works Director in Toppenish. He's an author. His book, Kamayakan Country, was published in 2017. He published an article in the winter 2021 issue of Columbia Magazine that received a John McClellan Jr. Award as best article published during the previous year. And that was called Written Under Duress, The Abduction of Involuntary Scribe Frederick White. And Joe's also published articles in the Pacific Northwest Quarterly. So we are really pleased to have him with us tonight, this afternoon, this evening. Thank you so much, Joe, for being here.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. We're really glad to be here. So this is a history program about the Yakima Valley in the 1850s, and also incorporates a lot of the Washington Territory history and revolves around our own Chief Kamayakan of the Yakima Valley. So we're really fortunate that we still have a lot of historical reminders of this period of our past. And the first slide starts off with Fort Simcoe, which of course is just about 30 miles outside of town. And it has been preserved as a state park and is open seasonally beginning in April. A lot of beautiful views there. This is stimulating, thinking about the wagon supplies and the native travelers that came over the Simcoe Mountains, coming from the Columbia River in the Dalles area, and then ending up at the Fort Simcoe as their destination. Another very well-known reminder is the St. Joseph Mission out on Ahtanum Road. The mission was established in 1852, so it's been around longer than the treaty has. So that's a wonderful place to visit, and we're thankful that the church keeps this well maintained and open to the public. Another monument that some people don't know about is out on Weenass Road, there's a monument to Chief Owhi, who had his gardens out in the Weenass Valley for his family, probably for centuries. But it was first discovered in 1853 when George McClellan came out as a surveyor to look for a railroad route. And even before the treaties were negotiated. And so he met with Chief Owhi right out here in our Weenass Valley. And he writes in his memoirs about the chief and his people raising crops of potatoes and corn and raising cattle. So farming was going on before the outsiders came. Another existing memorial is out at the Yakama Nation tribal offices. They have a beautiful memorial along with their Vietnam and World War II and World War I monuments in recognition of Yakama tribal members' activity in our armed forces. Well, anyway, nice looking monument with featuring Chief Kamaikan, and also has the names of the other signers, the chiefs that signed the Treaty of 1855. So war broke out in October of 1855 after the treaty was signed, and it's mostly disagreements about how much land should be relinquished by the tribes. And there are also violent reactions to assaults upon Native women by miners who had come into the Yakima Valley on their way to the Colville mines. That's
just click it. I think it'll just go forward.
oh, okay. I don't have to find another monument that still exists that not too many people have seen. It's a little hard to find. You have to go outside of Goldendale North, and there's a little dirt road called Monument Road. And that's where the original marker was set by the Washington State Historical Society back in 1913, I think it was. So that was the site where Indian Agent Bolon was slain, which was another big precipitating moment in the war period. So Chief Kamaikan became the leading spirit during these war years due to his unique ability to inspire members of many tribes across a wide region. And these are artifacts.
Go backwards now. Don't hit that one.
Actual, yeah, these are artifacts at Yakima Museum, Yakima Valley Museum, and they look to be authentic from the 1800s period. But also the tribes had access to modern weapons, and that gave them equal footing. At the beginning of the war, they had rifles, and a number were also armed with cap and ball pistols. So often it was a fair fight. So the first big clash between the U.S. Army and Kamaikan's warriors happened at Toppenish Creek. It began on October 6th. Haller had come across into Yakima country from Fort Dalles with 108 soldiers, and his mission was to apprehend the killers of the miners. But what he ran into was Chief Kamaikan and hundreds of warriors allied from tribes throughout the region. So anyway, Kamaikan's forces repelled the troops and inflicted 5 fatalities and 17
We need to
wounded.
get a little closer here.
Do I need to get closer, or?
I can put it this way.
No, that's good. Please mute yourself if you're not muted. Thank
Okay.
you, Joe.
Major Haller, and I'm gonna focus on the resources of the actual eyewitness participants. And Major Haller, who was right in the thick of things, left behind diaries and letters and detailed reports. And he was also very gregarious. He met as many Indian leaders as he could. He was friendly with the Catholic missionaries who knew the tribes really well. And his documents are mostly located at the University of Washington Special Collections. But there are other places. The Yakima Valley Library right here in Yakima in the Relander collection. Click Relander made typescripts of volumes and volumes of Heller's work. So he has been an excellent resource to learn about what really happened back in the 1850s. Well, after Kamaikan's victory, there are a lot of anxious volunteer soldiers that came up from Oregon. Oregon was much more heavily populated than Washington, and their fear, and I looked into it, you know, why did these people leave their families and come hundreds of miles from their homes in the middle of winter? And they were sincerely afraid that the tribal outbreak was going to pour into the Willamette Valley. And that's why the Oregon volunteers responded so aggressively. Well, we learned a lot from them. Fortunately, there was a lot of intelligent, thorough Oregon volunteers who wrote their memoirs, wrote journals, wrote diaries. And among them are William Stillwell, who was an eyewitness at the Embry Mountain battle just outside of Toppenish, and Plimpton Kelly was another one, and whose journals has been published by Washington State Historical Society and edited by Father Bischoff, who is an excellent historian as well. More monuments. Right outside of Union Gap, we have 2 stone monuments commemorating the Battle of Two Buttes. And that's where the Yakima warriors held off 800 soldiers, combination of US soldiers and volunteers, for 2 or 3 days before they had to retreat. Other really good resources. Philip Sheridan wrote a book of his memoirs, and he was familiar with a lot of the conflicts and activities here in Washington and Eastern Washington. Captain Edward Ord, one of my favorite military officers. They had a whole fort named after him in California, but hopefully we'll get to it. He wrote a letter. Back in those days, if they didn't agree with their commanding officers, they could just write letters to the editor in the newspaper. And Edward Ord had one of the best ones. And then there was Gabriel Rains. And he was actually in charge of Major Haller and in charge of most of the troops in Eastern Washington. And he was one of the few regular Army officers that really, let's say, had a difficult personality. His own officers didn't care for him at all. He's the one who wrote the really insulting letter back to Chief Kamaikan, and we can get details from that in the book. But he unfortunately is the one that kind of ruins it for the rest of his soldiers. And sure enough, he went to the Confederate side when the Civil War broke out. So. All right, where's my little arrow? Well, so what about the native sides of the story? You know, those sides haven't been ignored either. And when people look closely, the native side of these experiences, even though they weren't physically writing down journals themselves, has been recorded by a lot of folks who also were eyewitnesses at the time. I have some examples. Some of the best examples were the 2 Catholic missionaries that were out here in the Yakima Valley, Father Pandosy and Father Charus. They wrote letters, numerous letters to their supervisor, keeping him informed on what was going on. And they also lived with the native people, like sometimes in the same lodge. So if anyone knew the native folks, well, it was these Catholic missionaries. And their letters were all written in French. Some of them have been translated, but all of them are written in French and published in a book that that's available at University of Washington and another one at Gonzaga. And I was able to copy all the ones that were written in the Yakima Valley. And my French Canadian Catholic mother-in-law was able to translate all the letters for me. And so it played a large part in the research that I was able to do for my writings. And then the chiefs themselves, Chief Kamaikan, you know, when he spoke at the Treaty Council, you know, his words were written down. And his brother, Chief Skloom, he was also a treaty negotiator. So, and he also had many conversations with a lot of the white folks that were out here in the area. So they were good resources themselves. And then the real bonus was educated men who were open-minded, sympathetic to the Native cause, but not overly sympathetic, and actually collected the words and tales and experiences of so many Native folks that participated in the 1850s. And believe it or not, Edward Curtis made 2 or 3 trips out to the Yakima area in the early 1900s, took wonderful photographs of Chief Owhi's sons. And he had long interviews with them that he published in his multi-volume North American Indian. And there's a copy of that at the Cultural Center Library. So a person could actually visit that library and read the Curtis interviews of our eyewitness Native participants. And of course, L.V. McWhorter, he lived here. And so he found the old chiefs and warriors and met them personally and sat down, had his interpreters with him, and just has a wealth of information. And then of course, A.J. Splone, who wrote the book about Kamaikan, he knew one of the most prominent men, Chief Aeneas, who actually lived just a mile or 2 from Splone out in the Cowiche. So he got a lot of his information from eyewitnesses too. We like these guys. And then Chief Owhi's sons themselves. These are the 2 that were interviewed by all 3 of those men. Curtis interviewed them, McWhorter interviewed them, and Splone got to hear a big long speech by Lookout that is in Splone's book about Kamaikan. It's pretty interesting if you take the time to take a second look at it. But and thankfully, Edward Curtis, the fine photographer that he is, left us with the images of these gentlemen that graces our history books today. Warriors, yeah, Tokaikan Twiwash, also known as Tom Smartlow later on. He was a fighting warrior at Satus Creek, 2 buttes, and he went and crossed over on snowshoes with Qualchan and about a band of 50 that went over and helped the war effort on the Puget Sound side. And Chief Moses, who was a symbol of peace most of his life, when he was 20 years old, he was one of the warriors at Satus Creek, and he had the foresight to talk about it. We have interviews from him too. Okay, the Walla Valley.
Wally.
Oh my gosh, we have a miss. Thank you. Well, that's why we have John here. I told you he'd be correcting my mistakes. Okay, we'll fix that. Narcisse Canoyer, he operated as an officer in the Oregon Mounted Volunteers, and he was actually in charge of taking care of 150 peaceful Cayuse and Walla Walla people. When the Oregon Volunteers invaded the Walla Walla Valley, they didn't annihilate everybody. The groups and the families and the tribes that were friendly were actually protected by the Oregon Mounted Volunteers. So it's important to read the whole story. And then there were many Cayuse chiefs that were also peaceful and agreeable, and they were the ones that that cooperated with connoisseurs. So there's a lot to learn about our history rather than just the brief 1 or 2 sentences that we hear about. Okay, and the interpreters, how important. The people that spoke both languages fluently. William Cameron McKay was actually the second secretary at the 1855 Treaty Council, because they had one assigned to the Oregon superintendent, and of course Doty was the secretary for Isaac Stevens. But he was right there, recorded every word. In fact, many of the pages that he wrote by the campfire during the Treaty Council are in the University of Oregon special collections, and I got to hold them in my hand, and it was pretty neat. John McBean, his father, William McBean, was the chief trader at Fort Walla Walla, and so Johnny grew up speaking the native language of the Walla Walla and Cayuse people, and since his mother was a half-blood, he actually had a lot of native physical features himself, and was even mistaken as a native fellow a couple of times. But anyway, he was an outstanding interpreter, got along with both sides really well, and really contributed a lot. In fact, he went back to Washington, D.C. with the chiefs after the war to help them meet with the president. Chief Spokane Garry, another outstanding guy. When he was a teenager, he got sent back to the Red River settlement, and they had him go to a school there for a couple of years with the Hudson Bay employee families. And so when he came back to Spokane country, he was bilingual. And so he attended the Treaty Council, understood what was going on both sides of the negotiations. And then during the war period, he was able to meet with the government and the soldiers and explain what was going on and how the native people were interpreting what was happening to them. And then also up in the Walla Walla Valley, there's a monument up there that commemorates Chief Pew Pew Mox Mox, who was a prominent chief and a good close friend of Kamiakan. So that's still there. That's another permanent monument. Oh, and this is pretty neat. Kamiakan's victory, when Kamiakan beat the soldiers, it set off a wave of emotion all across the territory. So the tribes in Western Washington were encouraged that they could drive the settlers out for good. And so that's why they also went to war. So I was able to find a book from the 1800s that has a sketch of what Seattle looked like around 1860. And it only had a population of about 150, but that's what it looked like when all this was going on. And then also in Western Washington, there's monuments that still stand. The very first white people killed were Lieutenant McAllister and Michael Connell on October 27th, 1856. And this monument's still out there at Connell's Prairie. And then there's another one outside of, okay, why am I losing it? Anyway, it's in Western Washington. I'll look it up in my book and tell you exactly. But anyway, the Washington State Historical Society erected it years ago when it was popular to commemorate historical events. And I found another photo. Now, Olympia actually was the biggest city in Washington back in those days, if you can count a population of 400 as big. But that was the main city. It was the capital then. And here is an artist's view of what it looked like. And then Steilacoom was the other town. There was only like 3 towns, and Steilacoom was the smallest one. And if it wasn't for the U.S. Army fort, there would hardly be any people at all. But this engraving was done just a couple of years after the war. But it's pretty neat. That's what it looked like. There was a lot of boats, a lot of boat traffic, and not very many houses. Okay, more valuable resources. Not most of the United States Army officers were educated men. They were graduates of West Point. Many of them had a lot more schooling than that, and most of them were very rational, even-tempered men, just out there doing their job. In fact, both of these men and a lot of others have really, I'm not sure the best way to explain it, but anyway, they're real rational descriptions of their opponents, and they didn't look upon the chiefs as an enemy. They looked upon them as opponents and potential individuals to bring to a peaceful conclusion. And then LESH-I, he's a really famous name. He was in Nisqually, related to the Yakamas, and that's one of the reasons that there was a lot of activity going on both sides, is because the Yakama people went over to help LESH-I. He was a leading spirit, been a lot written about him, but you can see there's a beautiful monument, and that's going to be around for a while. And then there was a conflict. The U.S. Army and General Wall and the civilians, represented by Isaac Stevens, did not share the same values on how to take care of the issues of the day. So there's a whole chapter in the book just about them not getting along. And then there were Native allies, big chiefs that actually fought, and their men died on the side of the American soldiers. One of the famous names on the west side is Pat Canham, Snoqualmie chief. And then Spotted Eagle of the Nez Perce. He commanded Native soldiers for the Washington Territory Volunteers and for the United States Army. So he and his opinion is that the Native people were friendly to Lewis and Clark when they first came into Nez Perce country, and he was going to keep it that way. And then there was right outside of Satus Creek, or outside of Toppenish, was Satus Creek, and there's the geographic form Embry Mountain. Well, it's named for this man. He was an aggressive Oregon volunteer, and he and 9 others went charging up on top of this hill, thinking they were going to be predominant, and there was about 150 warriors waiting for them up on top of the hill. So he lost his life, and sure enough, they erected a monument in 1920, and that monument's still at Post Office Park in Toppenish, downtown. So there's a lot of reminders of our history. More fighting. Oh, the Washington Volunteers, they went down to Oregon because there were some Cayuse and Walla Walla hostiles that hadn't formally surrendered yet. So he pursued them and their families down there, and engaged in pretty controversial battle. I'm going to write another book just about that. Well, and here's our Fort Simcoe again. It was built in the winter of 1856, and subject of a lot of exciting stories. And Mary Lou was talking about this article that came out last year called Written Under Duress, and it was about a civilian herder, Frederick White, who was kidnapped by Chief Skloom and forced to write letters of complaint to the commanders at Fort Simcoe, listing his grievances. And So coincidentally, when I started writing this story 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot of snow out there, so I was able to go out and get some pretty decent winter photographs to represent those days back in 1857. Okay, 2 commanders out at Fort Simcoe. Robert Garnett was the most aggressive, and James Archer was a captain. And another lucky thing for us is Captain Archer wrote numerous letters back home to his mother and his sister, and the family kept them all, and so they are now a part of historical record, and his letters in typescript are at Yakima Valley Libraries, and it's so revealing because he tells it from a human point of view when he's talking to his family rather than the official military report. Garnett, he was almost all military reports, but those are revealing as well. And a person could get into the National Archives and find those correspondences that he wrote to his commanders. Steptoe battle up on Spokane country. This happened on May 17th, 1858. The war is still going on. And there's a lovely monument there within view of Steptoe Butte, where the battle did not take place. They just named the highest hill after Steptoe. But it's probably the one battle in Washington that has been written about enough where most people in America know about this one, but it's one of the few. Well, the attacks kept coming, even though Colonel Wright had made peace with the majority of the tribal chiefs. The hostile bands were still on the go, and they attacked more miners, one group at the Wenatchee River and another group at the Okanogan River in June, July of 1858. So that's when the Army geared up, brought in reinforcements from California and back east, and set out to end the war. The one branch out of Fort Simcoe under Garnett went towards Wenatchee because their tribal informants had let them know that the attackers of the miners were hanging out there. And that's why they went that direction. And then the rest of them were up in the Spokane country. And so Colonel Wright took his soldiers up there. So it was a two-pronged approach in the late summer of 1858. These are 2 of the officers under Garnett that operated around the Wenatchee area. And Crook wrote a book. And so we learn a lot from him, from his memoirs. That one's easy to find. Fraser, not so easy to find, but he did write many reports, and a researcher going into the National Archives could find his experiences. And of course, Colonel Wright, he led the largest assault, and that's where he confronted Owhi and Qualchan. Qualchan was executed because he'd made several attacks on civilians. And that's where Wright drew the line. If a fighter had fought the Army man to man, and then if they lost and turned in all their stolen property, Wright let them go. But if they had been involved with attacking miners or any settlements, that's where he went to capital punishment. And I know he's very controversial for that, but another monument, 4 Lakes, Washington. If you've ever been there, I don't know if the tavern's still open, but I used to hang out there. Beautiful little monument, and you have to go into town. Hard to find, but
Where is this? Where's 4 Lakes?
just outside of Cheney. You just turn off I-90 on your way to Spokane before you go to Cheney.
Okay.
And you can get in there and find that if you're really interested. And then another monument about Spokane Plains And this is located just outside of Fairchild Air Force Base. It's another one put up by the Washington State Historical Society. See, back in the 1920s and 30s, people, because a lot of the survivors are still alive, and they had a lot of respect for the history that their parents and grandparents went through. Oh, so this is the handbook, and it's really, I carry one with me all the time because, says, well, how many people died at Lake Wenatchee? Well, if you know about what happened, you just flip into Appendix C, and then you can find out exactly what the fatalities were, who they were allied with. And so it's really kind of a guidebook and a handbook with a narrative, starting with signing of the treaty until the last battle was fought. So that's why I recommend it. It's not a very big book and it's not expensive, but if you're interested in following the origin behind all these monuments, this is probably the easiest way to have it explained. It's a lot faster than the 20 years it took me to research it all. Uh-oh. Okay, that's my last slide. How am I doing?
The reason there were so many monuments at that time is that was really an outgrowth of the Civil War and the centennial of 1876. In America, we didn't have much interest at all in marking our history and whatnot until after the Civil War. And then it suddenly became a whole industry, basically, of monuments and monument companies and marking all these different sites and whatnot. And of course, obviously, they're going to mark a lot of the sites that had to do with the glories of the Euro-American settlement across the country, as opposed to the Native Americans in different parts of the country. But that was really the impetus. And in fact, you'll see that there are in monument companies that you'll see the same monument all across the country with just different wording on it, because you buy it from a manufacturer. The one that's here in Yakima, for example, of the soldier that's on top of the Colonel Weisenberger monument, that's a stock. He's a stock man. It's just a stock soldier. You'll find that same soldier all over. There's one in Walla, for example, just like him. And there's one in another part of the country too. But the base of the monument here is what's different. And all these monuments for these different battles and whatnot are all, the glories of how Washington and our country came out of nothing to be this great place it was. And so the whole marking, it dealt to do monuments and markers, all came out of that. Those were really important things for a lot of historical societies in the early days. Even the Yakima Valley one, they would go places just to look at markers and sites, or you'd see marks of pre-up sites and stuff. New York State is really famous for them. They have these blue ones with a yellow rim on them that were put up all over the state during the 40s and 50s. And they mark all these different kinds of things. But that's why you see so many of these right at that time. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with the Old West. It's just it came out of we were wondering about, they were marking all these stuff. So that's kind of was the background for marking or monuments anyway.
Any questions?
Okay, let's see.
Joe?
Yep, Ray, go ahead.
Joe, I wonder if you'd comment on, I think in May of 1856, in some of the military records, maybe Bischoff compiled some of this information. Some of the military records indicate that there was a specific military strategy to defeat the Yakama warriors by capturing the Selah fishery and depriving them of food source.
Yeah.
And right around Selah Gap, and there wasn't an actual battle there, but I think if I remember correctly, the U.S.Army was trapped. There was flooding in the Natchez River. They were trapped. They couldn't get across the river, and so the tribal members escaped at that point, and there was not a successful strategy. But could you comment on that strategy to, sort of capture?
Well, the whole, Wright's purpose, because he was working for General Wool at the time, and Wool did not want to fight a war with the native people. He said the only reason the native people are hostile is because the volunteers have been abusing them. So Wright was there on a peacekeeping mission, walking softly, carrying a big stick. But to get compliance, one of Wright's thoughts was to cut off one of their food source areas so that they would come to Fort Simcoe for flour, and they gave away thousands of pounds of flour to keep to essentially keep the Yakama people close to Fort Simcoe. But he was on a mission to go to the Wenatchee River and back and round up all these Yakama folks and bring them back around the area of Fort Simcoe to secure the peace. And the Wenatchee, when they got to the Wenatchee's River, it was running so high they had to stop for about a month because they couldn't get across with their pack mules. But Indians could get across because they're just better at crossing streams. And so they came over and they had meetings with Wright and Colonel Haller or Major Haller. And Haller has kept a really close record of what he talked about with Owhi and Qualchan. And so they were negotiating, and where it seemed to fall apart is that it was not the native custom to turn in all the stolen property. And Owhi explained to Haller that when they're at war with the Blackfeet, their custom is to just leave things the way they are on the day they have the conference. But Colonel Wright, being a government employee, said that's not possible. You have to return it all. And that's where it fell apart. And the Owhi family went one way, but the majority of Yakama people did comply with Wright. They said, fine, we're for peace. Chief Aeneas is a good example. He was a fine warrior, and he says, it's not worth risking our women and children and elderly, to try to battle 600 armed soldiers. So the majority were peaceful around Fort Simcoe for the next 2 years until the war was finally stopped.
Lois?
Yeah, early in the presentation, you mentioned 2 priests that were serving as translators. Do you remember if they were Franciscans or Jesuits or secular priests?
They are oblates, oblates of Mary Immaculate. And that was an order that they came out of France, and there was like 7 or 8 of them that came into Eastern Washington, and Father Charus and Pandosy, and then 2 others that served in the Yakama area were Father D'Herbaume, and then the other one was Paul Durieux, and they both went on to become bishops of like Western United States. But when they were young men, they worked they worked here in the Yakama Valley and slept on the cold ground, and really were incredible people. Unfortunately, they wrote lots of letters, and so we were able to understand their experiences, what they went through.
So in general, were those, was that order better with the Native Americans than, say, the Franciscans?
I wouldn't say they're better. I'm more familiar with the Jesuits because they were up in like the Coeur d'Alene area, and then and I think they were just as compassionate and sincere between those 2 orders, and those are the ones that I'm most familiar with because they worked in the Pacific Northwest with the groups that I researched the most. And gosh, if you read chapter 10, the priest up at Coeur d'Alene, he just worked so hard to try to keep things from getting out of hand. In fact, he was so impressive that one of the Army officers. When the war was over, he went back home to New York and joined the Catholic Church. That's how impressed he was.
It's amazing. Are there other questions? Karen?
I have the memory that from living in Liberty Lake that there was a monument over there near what's now the way station about killing all the horses.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there is one. I didn't photograph it, sorry. But that was Wright's nail in the coffin, because when the soldiers came in, a lot of the native renegades took off with like 1,000 horses, and Wright got together with his men, and they figured if they let them get away with all these horses, they'll never stop attacking. So they counseled very regretfully, at least they, yeah, I believe them. No man who rides a horse takes joy in killing a horse, but they had to do it because they couldn't afford to come back again. Their mission was to put this war down. It had been going on for 3 years. It was expensive and deadly, and they came up with the best strategy they could for 1858 on how to shut it down and squash it and end it. And that's what they came up with. And of course, today it's horrific and they get a lot of criticism for it, but on the other hand, it worked.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, Joe and
Marge Peters. You
Yeah.
gotta unmute here. There we go.
Oh, it was a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering if you are aware of a monument in Ellensburg that is on the old road. So if you go through the town of Ellensburg and you are going to get back onto the freeway, you go past, I can't remember the name of it. It's a hamburger stand. It looks like a Flying A gas station. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah, I know what you're
Right
at.
across the road from there is in the bushes, a monument to Chief Alki, I believe it is. It just, it's-
How high, maybe?
or maybe I'm not sure. It's to a Seattle chief, and I haven't been there for quite a while, but it's in the bushes, and we just happened to park there to go across the street to get a hamburger several years ago, and here was this monument. It just seems so out of place. It's
I want to
not
know about
high.
that.
It's flat. I believe it's not a high, big monument. But it's a cement monument, and it's been there for long enough for the blackberries to grow around it.
Okay.
Oh,
Have to go check it out when it snow melts.
Okay, what's there? What business is close by now?
It's right by that. I think it's still that hamburger place, the Flying A.
Yeah.
It's red and white building, and
Yeah, it's very distinctive. You'll know it when you're going out of Ellensburg. It looks like an old gas station.
Yeah.
But, an old-fashioned gas station.
it's a
It's
restaurant.
white, and it's very distinctive when you go by.
What else is around it? Which
Well, now they have a lot of new buildings that are being built out there in terms of like there's an eye doctor complex kind of thing. And
is it
But
out where the car dealership is?
No, that's a different road. This is a road, where the eyeglass, you're talking about the one just as you come off the freeway and kind of head back south. This road, you come through Ellensburg and you go, that's the old road that would take you.
yeah, it's basically the old highway.
Okay, where that old mobile station is?
That's
road?
the place. That's what you're
Okay.
talking about. Yeah.
Okay, Mobile Station Road.
Yeah.
That's how I remember
Yeah,
it.
I'm pretty sure that's what you're talking about. Yeah.
but I need to know where to look on the ground.
Well, walk across the street from that from that restaurant, just walk across the road and kind of explore around on that side of the road, and it's there.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good one. That's a good one.
I have to go find that, but right now you're probably not going to find it.
No.
Yeah,
Break the snow off.
there's more snow there than here, so I'll put it on my calendar for March.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe and John, and thank you all of our all of our participants and viewers today. I think you've definitely proved to me that the more people who join, the more interesting we get. I loved all the questions, and I personally am going to go buy Joe's book because I realized how little I know about this history. And it's fascinating. It's so interesting how many points of view you've included, and I can't wait to read it. So,
well, yeah, and I intend to be balanced because that's how it needs to be presented, so that
right.
You know, not or against any culture or group. It's just what happened.
And what group but this Marge in particular could come up with an assignment for our presenter. That's even more amazing. Thank you, Marge. You've got a new place for him.
Buy the book at the museum.
Pardon me?
Can you buy
Yeah,
the?
we have it here.
Do you?
And I think they also have it at Inklings, don't they?
Yeah, Inklings, yeah, they'll get it for you. If the fastest is Amazon or any of your internet bookstores.
Shocking.
But a lot of folks like to shop local, and so they just go to Inklings. If they don't have it on the shelf, they'll get it for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. And thanks everyone for joining us. And I'm just going to say very quickly that we have coming up on February 2nd, Nate Pohl of Inversion Design Build, which is a group that is trying to end housing insecurity and build safe, resilient, affordable home ownership, is going to do a presentation for us on auxiliary dwelling units and what their role is in trying to get more affordable housing. So we hope you'll join us for that. That's on, you'll be getting a message from Chrissy about that. It's on February 2nd. We have other programs in planning stages. We're so glad you all joined us this afternoon. And Joe, again, our great thanks. It was a wonderful presentation. John, thanks for coming on. We got you on, even if a few minutes late, and we're really pleased that you could join us this afternoon.
Yay.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
See you all.
War history, fantastic.